Okay, we should start, but I'm a little bit mystified as to who's going to speak, which is why I'm kind of confused. I know that Regina and I are going to speak about innovation systems for growing a sustainable bioeconomy, and then I think we'll be followed by Chris Barrett, who will be talking about some new ways of using intellectual property to spread valuable technology in medical area, I think mainly. Then we're going to have our final speaker who will be speaking about the greenhouse gas issues in the prairie. This may not seem like it fits together, and that's because we don't want to miss out on the presentation about the greenhouse gases in the prairie, because otherwise she might leave us too soon, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was scheduled to present on Friday, but yeah, I asked to present earlier, so I'm outlier a little bit.
That's all right.
Yeah, so I will give you a break, after the presentation to move to a probably completely different topic. Sorry for that.
No problem. We're going to you'll find out that you're the outlier probably in other ways also, that you're well organized for your presentation, whereas Regina and I are still working on ours. So ours is very much a work in progress, and I think that Chris also wanted to is trying new ideas. We have let's see. I think so I guess we can get started, and excuse me, we'll sort of see how this works out. We have one monitor that we can share and one monitor up there, and so we'll see how this all goes. So our presentation is going to be first, and we're sort of sharing that presentation, Regina and I. And so Regina, if you want to go ahead, and we'll see how much we can get through and how coherent we can be as we share this presentation.
Well, thank you, Carl. It's my great pleasure. I hope you can all hear me. I'm Regina Birner from the University of Hohenheim. And so our motivation for this paper is that growing consensus among governments, firms, and civil society has been established that innovation is essential for sustainable development, especially also for reaching the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And innovations do obviously have an important potential to overcome the trade-offs, and some have already been mentioned in previous presentations. There's an increasing recognition that bioeconomy can be a transformation strategy to sustainability. And what we want to look in this presentation is, what can we learn from this overlapping crisis, COVID-19 and the food and energy crisis caused by the war? What we observe that governments are increasingly supporting innovation in response to this overlapping crisis, but we believe that by comparing different areas, we can learn some lessons. So what can policymakers and entrepreneurs actually learn so that they can do a better job in promoting innovations? And what we do here, we develop a bioeconomy in innovation systems framework. And then we use this framework to look at innovations in 3 areas. And these 3 areas are health. So here we look at the vaccine development for COVID-19. The second one is food. So here we look at innovations in new plant and animal varieties through gene editing. And the third one is fuel. So here we can actually build upon the previous presentation by Madhu. Here we look at biofuels or bioenergy. So here you can see the conceptual framework, which we developed based on a framework that has been widely used in innovation studies, and that is called the National Innovation Systems Framework. And we applied that here to the bioeconomy. And in this innovation systems framework, we distinguish different domains. So one is very important. Obviously, many of us are in this domain. We can call this the public research and education domain. Yeah, so academic research and education organizations, but also other publicly funded research organizations, training institutes are in this domain. Yeah, traditionally, of course, research is important for innovation there. But then obviously we have the business domain for the bioeconomy. And here we have research-based companies in agribusiness or in the medical field. We have the farmers, farmer-based organizations. We have startups, but in the field of medicine, also, of course, hospitals, pharmacies, doctors, and the financial institutions are also a very important component of this business domain. And then what research on innovation systems has shown, what is important are the bridging institutions, yeah, that bridge these two domains. And that could be extension services, especially in the agricultural area, innovation platforms, but especially with regard to biotechnology, technology transfer offices. David Silverman has done a lot of research on that, and academic journals. So these are essential elements of the innovation systems framework. But then what drives innovation is the demand. Yeah, that is also very inherent in economic theories of innovation. Yeah, this demand, which can come from business to business, from the end users, and it can be national, but it can also be international, because these linkages, this is a national perspective, which is useful for policymakers at the national level. But of course, we have to take the global perspective. So the international linkages, both of the business domain, but also of this public research and education domain, is very relevant. And then, of course, policies can influence basically every aspect, every domain here. Yeah, that's why we have this multiple arrows. So innovation policies, bioeconomy policies and strategies, and of course, regulations. We have heard a lot about that already. And then another aspect of this innovation system are social cultural factors that may differ across countries or regions, like the propensity to take risk, social capital, trust, learning orientation, and others. And the idea of this framework here is that if we look into different case studies, that we identify where have been bottlenecks, where have been strong domains, and what can be learned, especially with regard to policies and regulations. And with that, I hand over to Carl.
That's right. Regina didn't want to have to deal with this particular mess here that's up on the screen right now. This is really something for the paper rather than something to really get into. But the case studies that we're doing are along along my left also, which I can't see. So the mRNA vaccines for COVID. We're going to look particularly at gene editing for developing new crop and animal varieties, and then biofuel. And across the top are these different components that were in the model that basically that was just described by Regina. So the first model is the health part of the bioeconomy, if you will, and the development of mRNA vaccines for COVID in particular. So the public domain has had, some people in that have had a long-term interest in vaccines, particularly NIH in the US, National Institute of Health, working on AIDS vaccines, but also other components of the government that have been interested in ways, well, the Defense Department interested in ways of producing vaccines quickly in response to anything from new epidemics to bioweapons and things like that. The basic research on mRNA vaccine was really the model of the scientists sitting in her labs in Philadelphia at University of Pennsylvania, working on mRNA pretty much on her own. Not much funding, some funding from the government, US government. And then the other thing produced in the public domain has been the research tools, everything from stabilizing mRNA to the lipids that are used in encoding the vaccines. The bridges that Regina already mentioned are the things such as university faculties in universities that are used to developing companies. A lot of American universities are very much into it. German universities also, obviously. And these go on with the assistance of organizations like the Technology Transfer Office, but also talking to other colleagues that have already developed their own companies. So you get the serial innovators. And then the business domain is where the business companies pick up. So venture capital sees opportunities for markets for cancer vaccines, for instance, in the personal medicine area. Both Moderna and BioNTech were looking into that. And then when COVID comes along, you get this major demand and opportunity for investments and money making, frankly, in developing these COVID vaccines. They then have to figure out how to produce the vaccines, how to decide whether they should produce it themselves or they should contract it out to somebody else, and then and then they have to build their production chains and their marketing chains in order to do this. And this happened with the assistance of many governments around the world, not only the US. This induced this explosion of knowledge on vaccines. This is just publications, and the publications and the knowledge and the technology components turned into the vaccines. The mRNA vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, and BioNTech, these adenovirus-based vaccines such as AstraZeneca, J&J, Sputnik 5, were all developed as and extensively used as of late 2021, which this graph shows. Now, the role of government in all this, and I'm going to have to restrain myself, is obviously this publicly funded basic research, which creates the basis for reacting to the pandemic crisis that came along. And then the reaction to the crisis has been huge amounts of funding by governments in US, Europe, and China around the world in speeding up the regulatory process, billions to do what you could call translational research for changing the mRNA into extra vaccines, and guarantees for procurement, financial support for production process, and ultimately then financial support for international spread of these vaccines. So which countries were successful and why? Was it have to do with policies? Obviously the mRNA vaccines that are famous are now the United States, and in the mRNA area only for this, United States and Germany developed these things first. This some kind of combination of the basic research, the university industrial complex, venture capital, public money, et cetera. The contrast is China, which has not developed their own mRNA vaccines, possibly because of some of the problems with mRNA vaccines, such as how do you get them out there spread widely when you have to do this extreme cold storage. But also clearly the desire for self-sufficiency and trying to develop this internally, particularly when you've got the conventional vaccines that they geared up very quickly for this. So this is not an answer. This is some speculation on our part. mRNA production also, China is not allowed the BioNTech JV that could have started production immediately with their other vaccines. Indian companies haven't been able to get access to them, but now some South African companies and consortiums have developed them with the help of FAO, but now it's too late because there's no market for them, unfortunately. So there's a mixed story on the spread of these things. let me go quickly into the food area that may be of more interest to people here, talking specifically, taking the case of the CRISPR-Cas9 in agriculture. Of course, the baseline was conventional breeding, and we heard a lot about that by our keynote speaker today, which also, discussed radiation, chemical mutations, things of that sort. These, but public research has then gone ahead and develop the basic research on how cells defend themselves. That was work at Berkeley and Broad Institute and Vilnius. Tools to modify these genes from MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, and many of the companies that our speaker is involved with. And then research to develop the disease resistance and quality traits that, or things such as improved photosynthesis. The technology transfer, the bridging institutions are these technology transfer offices. In the business domain, venture capitalists see opportunities to, for markets and finance startups for marketing the IP, the property rights and the tools. And this is giving you some examples, some of which you probably already know, but also new companies like Benson Hill, which spun off from Monsanto when Bayer bought them. They're using CRISPR and directed breeding to develop more productive organic foods and developing, again, their own markets, their own production chain. We'll see if that is ever profitable. But and finally, established companies see these markets and license the technology to amplify their own innovation, production, and marketing chains. Corteva has been the leader in the plant area, perhaps to avoid GMOs and paying Monsanto for them, or Bayer. And then Genus PLC has been using these pretty effectively in swine production for disease resistance. Too much complication here, but I don't know if you can see that at all, honestly. Well, I can see it, I can read it there, but you can't read it back far. But the basic story is that University of California Patent Office decided to exclusively license their IP to companies, I mean, mainly to Caribou Biosciences, which is owned by California and Jennifer Doudna and others. And those then got transferred to or licensed to DuPont and Pioneer. And at the same time, whoops, sorry. Sorry, I lost it now. At the same time, the patents from the Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT were licensed in not as exclusive licenses. They were available to anybody that wanted to pay the money and make themselves go ahead with the conditions that the Broad Institute put in place. And so the technology transfer took place through these organizations, but then further technology transfer took place through both the big private companies that are listed here, but also organizations like the International Rice Research Institute and ICRISAT and others. And so these applications of CRISPR have been for basic research, and also then for the development of disease-resistant, improved quality varieties. I think we're going to hear more about this, hopefully on Friday, from EU's Joint Research Center, which is going to talk about this. And then the gene-edited swine varieties are something that are in the regulatory pipeline right now. And international bridging institutes included the CGIAR, the multinational seed companies, and universities globally. Government, again, public funding, clarifying the patent ownership, and then the regulatory system. And so which types of gene editing are not GMOs and which are GMOs, which is sort of an artificial construct in many ways anyway. So this is where the government has come in, and then I'll turn it over to Regina for our last case study.
Right, so I think we are pressed for time, so quickly a final case study here. So bioenergy, of course, has been used for a long time in agriculture as a source of energy, if you think of feeding draft animals. But then, of course, the use of fossil fuels first removed this competition between food and feed until it was sort of reintroduced again. And different countries have very different, very interesting innovation stories on how they got into it. But Brazil, for example, is a very famous one. But for reasons of time, we cannot really go into it. But some studies by political scientists have shown that public opinion on biofuels started to shift from a positive to a rather negative image during the food price crisis of 2008. There has been substantial public and private research to make second and third generation biofuels, which would move us out of this food feed competition, as Madhu has so elaborately explained in the previous session. But in some way, one could say the bioeconomy innovation system has failed because I think I can remember having been here at a conference in 2006 or so. And even then people said, you know, we're always 2 years away from the breakthrough in the second generation biofuels. Now it's 2022 and we're still, it seems, 2 years away. So what can we say about the innovations here? This patent families for biofuels, not only second generation, but in general. And we see in various countries, US, Europe, and also China, an increasing interest of the private sector, but around, especially when there was very high fuel and food prices around 2008, but then also stagnation or decline. If we look specifically at the second generation, we need technologies or innovations to process lignocelluloses. And this is kind of a technological challenge involving 3 stages, and especially the so-called pre-treatment stage is very important, also very expensive. And this is where we are actually still waiting for the innovations. We also see, if we just look at patents for lignocelluloses, an increase. It slowed up a little bit later than for general biofuels. The leading countries here are actually the US. Out of all these patents between 2002 and 15, there were more than 640 from the US. Germany was the second largest country, but it was an order of magnitude lower, with only 65, and China with only 5 hasn't been in this field almost at all. What has been some trends in this in our framework, the public research and education domain? There was research, but it has flattened. The business domain has become a major source of innovation funding, as we have seen. And we have 2 main players here. So the incumbent chemical industry and the oil industry firms like BASF and Shell, for example, have been investing, but also small and new entrants. And the importance of the private sector, as we have seen, has increased over time. And here again, at some point using our framework, we are speculating what are possible reasons for this lack of progress. Certainly that the private sector, who has become a main investor, is dependent on the prices of fossil fuels. And when they go down, the incentives also go down. Madhu has that explained as well. There's probably also a fairly strong continuous interest and also lobbying for first generation biofuels. So that may also reduce the incentives to really get into the second generation ones, because there are vested interests and investments. And if you look at the current debate in Europe, there has been a very intense discussion of whether now, in view of this high food prices, should we actually remove the mandates for the biofuels. And those in this field say, well, but then this will really further remove the incentives to get into the second generation, now that we are really close to the second generation, as is claimed. Okay, I hand over to Carl for some final lessons.
Yes, some kind of lessons. This is where we have started to pull things together, and maybe in the last hour or so, it's kind of come together. We shall see. So the first one is that, you know, how has bioeconomy responded to these demands for sustainable biological innovations? Well, obviously in the medical area with the vaccines and now some new other therapeutic products, there has been a remarkable success. With agricultural biotechnology, the high food prices, high input prices, et cetera, there have been important changes. I mean, more and more use of the technology such as CRISPR and also big data, genomics, and GMOs, frankly. But it hasn't been the kind of dramatic response, and you wouldn't really expect a dramatic response, perhaps, that you see in the medical area. And then as Regina just finished up in the biofuels area, where we seem to be stuck on the at this point of how do we get the second generation fuels in place. So that's sort of where we are. What do we learn from this? Oh, where do I do down here? Well, you know, as economists, why we always want to, many of us want to go back to the fact that policies are important. And so just reviewing the three cases, it's clear that basic and applied public sector research is essential to responding to these crises. The mRNA vaccines were built on this huge wealth of information that's been building up on vaccines over the years in the public sector primarily, but also in the private sector, and we're able to take advantage of that. CRISPR, Cas9, genomics, big data, that's also been public funding, some NIH stuff, but also a lot in the agricultural sector. And then biofuel, we had this big bulge of spending in, you know, about, well, that was sort of reflected in those patent numbers that Regina showed. But then that's really fallen off, so that it does indicate that where we've got the big impacts is also where we've put the big money. Second is international collaborations. And reduced barriers to collaboration can also be important for public and private innovation. The Chinese example, I mean, we wouldn't have had these vaccines nearly as quickly if it hadn't been for the fact that almost immediately after the coronavirus had been COVID-19 had been sequenced, it was up on the web and available for all the companies and others to use it. On the other hand, China's self-sufficiency policy in vaccines has meant that there are no mRNA vaccines. So again, the international barriers are important. Finally, we've heard over and over again the importance of regulations, and these case studies, I think, just show this. You know, the big emphasis on reducing or, you know, collapsing and making more efficient the vaccine testing and regulations have been extremely important, and we're starting to see some changes in more countries accepting the gene editing, and a few big countries now, like China, accepting GMOs for commercial use. So just to wrap up, the crises created technological opportunities for research, as well as these political responses, spillovers from COVID vaccines to livestock and crops, spillovers into plant research. And here again, I'm kind of we're depending on biologists to set us straight here, so we can use your help. And then our final thing is that we need to understand and strengthen the bioeconomy innovation systems. And with that, I'm sure I've used up more than our time. And so I will say thanks, and let's see if Chris Barrett is available. All right, thank you.
Hey, Carl. Yeah, I'm here. I'm not finding a way I can share my screen, I'm afraid. I think I've been let in only as an audience member.
Well, at least we've got a good picture of you, so you're sharing your good looks with us. It's always good.
There.
Ah,
Does that work a little better?
yes, yeah, now we've
All
got you.
right. Great. So now let's see if I can share a screen successfully. Does that work?
Yes, excellent.
Oh, fabulous. It's always nice when these things work as planned. Well, my apologies for not being there in person with you all. I'm genuinely very disappointed. I was looking forward to this a lot. But hopefully we can have a chance to chat virtually via email or Zoom or what have you, or the next occasion to gather together. I wanted to present for the first time, actually, a new very brief thought piece that I have on a policy instrument that might help to induce more private impact investment in especially spaces that are commonly neglected, in neglected tropical diseases and orphan crops and other sorts of things. So I see this as complementing quite nicely what Carl and Regina were just presenting. Here I'd like to talk about how to induce more investment. And the core challenge is the unmet need for research and development that targets things experienced exclusively or mainly by the poor. So here I want to distinguish between neglected tropical diseases, things like dengue fever, schistosomiasis, or trypanosomiasis, afflictions that most of us in North America and Europe and high-income countries in Asia and Australia are fortunate to not really face. Yet there are like a good 2.5 to 3.5 billion people worldwide, by the best, albeit coarse estimates, who do face those sorts of afflictions. So this distinguishes these diseases from things like cancers or COVID that are experienced worldwide. The incentives to invest in a vaccine for COVID or a treatment for cancers, the commercial incentives are considerable because there are a lot of high-income people who face very real risks of those diseases. That's just not the same when you're talking about schistosomiasis or dengue fever, when the people who run the risk of infections are largely poor and their ability to pay is therefore very limited. We have a similar sort of issue for orphan crops that don't have a large commercial market in the high income world or in the middle income world, where there is large organized investment in agricultural technology, places like China or Brazil. So things like cassava and cowpea, the various millets, teff, there are hundreds of millions of acres planted in these crops, and as best as we can tell, closing on 1 billion poor farmers grow them. The investment returns on this sort of R&D seem to be quite high, but that is signaling, therefore, that we're underinvesting, that there's nowhere near enough money pouring in to help bring down rates of return on such R&D. And yet there's a huge amount of capital sitting on the sideline, private capital sitting on the sidelines. As of the close of 2021, the S&P 500 companies alone were sitting on $2.7 trillion, that's with a T, $2.7 trillion of cash or other short-term liquid investments, things like overnight loans or certificates of deposit. So things that could easily be freed up, signaling that they aren't seeing adequate investable projects. And with current interest and inflation rates, they're earning negative returns, really. So the fact that you have cash losing money in corporate hands that is about 2 orders of magnitude larger than the best estimates of what the investments are that are needed to attack non-tropical, neglected tropical diseases and orphan crops, there's clearly a mismatch here. And the problem I hypothesize, and others have said, is that the size of the commercial market for discoveries for neglected tropical diseases and orphan crops is just insufficient to induce private investment to come up with the discoveries that could have substantial impact at scale. So how do people tackle this? There are 2 broad strategies that get used. A very popular one in the last half dozen or dozen years in particular, but it really goes back easily to the 17th and certainly 18th centuries, are prizes and advanced market commitments, more recently impact investments. The key principle here is these are all promises of payments to the inventor who comes up with a breakthrough. So prizes, ag results is an example of this. Will Masters has written on this extensively and creatively. Prizes just promise some lump sum payment in the event that somebody comes up with a discovery that meets certain pre-specified criteria. So here you're in particular needing to lay out early on the key performance criteria, key technology characteristics that are needed, and the intent is the lump sum can cover the fixed costs of investment to come up with this discovery, so that even if somebody is then playing in a commercial, reasonably competitive commercial market after discovery, the large fixed costs up front that an R&D investor incurs are going to get covered and give them first mover advantage in the commercial market. Advanced market commitments of the sort that have been used extensively for COVID vaccines and treatments, that's simply guaranteeing a minimum market size. The government steps in and says, if you come up with an effective vaccine, we guarantee we will buy X number of shots for arms at Y price. So guaranteeing a minimum market. Slightly different technique than prizes, but the same basic principle. Gavi is a very effective example of that, especially for pneumococcal disease treatments. And then a little bit more recently, without governments always being involved, although about 2/3 or 3/4 of impact investment does involve government in some way, they're impact investments where there's some trigger in change in payment in the future based on measurable performance for any of a variety of environmental or social outcomes. And in the case of public goods, this is often triggered by future cost reduction. So for example, an effective treatment, you might have a Ministry of Health borrow money to invest in effective treatments for schistosomiasis on the basis of those treatments will reduce future costs of deworming campaigns. And so in the event of infection rates coming down, the investors get a higher return. Effectively, they're sharing in the cost reductions that come as a fruit of the discovery. These are all excellent devices, but the central problem is that they're clearly woefully insufficient. We're not getting anywhere near enough R&D, especially private R&D, going into attacking neglected tropical diseases, orphan crops, and similar sorts of challenges faced disproportionately or exclusively by the poor. There are at least 3 significant problems. One is the timing consistency. A prospective investor always faces some risk that having incurred major investments, that they won't wind up actually getting paid later on, that there's a change of government and the government that made an advanced market commitment or a prize reneges on that, or a philanthropy that is using its endowment, that its endowment just disappears, that it gets crashed by a Ponzi scheme operated by its principal investment manager, that the measures that are intended to trigger differential payments and impact investments, that those measures prove faulty. There are a variety of concerns that investors have about the timing consistency of payments. Governments in particular have limited fundraising capacity to make such commitments. And even if you don't worry too much about the first 2 problems, there are global public goods issues here, that no one entity is typically going to find it in their interest to finance the full global optimum of R&D. So a different set of strategies people use is, rather than making ex-ante financial commitments in the event of a discovery, grant ex post monopoly power to the inventor. And with that monopoly power, the inventor can then extract consumer surplus. So we do this in the form of patents and copyrights, et cetera, which are time-bound monopoly powers enforced by the state. So this capacity to extract consumer surplus in the event of discovery likewise gives an invention considerable profit potential. There are 2 main devices that are used for helping encourage private R&D through IP, through intellectual property, but R&D that can benefit the poor. The first is humanitarian use licensing. So essentially price discrimination. Allow, for example, the patent holder on an HIV/AIDS treatment or a COVID vaccine to charge a different price in poor communities in Africa, Asia, Latin America than they charge in Europe or North America. So this works quite well, but it doesn't work very well for neglected topics. It works well for neglected markets where you have COVID treatments for a high income market where charging high prices can enable adequate profit to induce private investment, and you can simply charge a different price in a poor market. Moreover, even when you have neglected markets, you still have technology mismatch problems that there are, for example, in agriculture, the maize varieties that can flourish and do well in the pest and pathogen environment and the agroecologies of the upper latitudes in Europe and North America are typically not well suited to the lower latitudes in Asia and Africa. So you'll get a corn variety and you might have the ability to price it differently, but it's not going to perform as well in poor areas if it wasn't developed for those particular contexts. So humanitarian use licensing, like advanced market commitments or prizes or impact investment, has a place, but its place is limited. And finally, there's a priority review voucher program that the US Food and Drug Administration runs, where somebody who comes up with a discovery for any of 27 listed rare diseases or neglected tropical diseases is granted a voucher that will jump their next submission to FDA for review to the front of the queue so that they get accelerated review. That will reduce commonly the duration of FDA review by 4 to 8 months, which is valuable because the clock is ticking on one's patented discovery. So the ability to make money in the market is a function of how long government regulators take in review before approving commercial release. But priority review vouchers are very limited in domain. It only has value to those applying for new discoveries that require FDA review, and its duration is limited to however long the accelerated review buys you. So a matter of a few months. The maximum value to date of the sale of a priority review voucher seems to be about $350 million, which is pretty good, but that's the max, and the average is in the 2 digits of millions of dollars, which is almost certainly insufficient to invest large-scale investment in trying to find a cure, a vaccine against dengue fever, for example. So all of those tools are helpful, but they're insufficient, as manifest in very low rates of investment and very high return on investment. So what can we do? So benevolent patent extensions are my proposed approach to supplement the existing toolkits. And part of this is inspired by a really interesting case, the case of eflornithine. So eflornithine was originally pursued as an R&D project commercially in the 1970s. It was a substance that was being explored as a prospective cancer treatment, and in the stage 1 trials, it proved ineffective. It failed. But serendipitously, the scientists working on eflornithine discovered that it was really good at treating advanced trypanosomiasis or sleeping sickness. So good, in fact, people refer to it as the Lazarus drug, bringing people back out of comas. And the World Health Organization added it to its essential medicines list because it was such a critical component of the toolkit needed to treat patients with advanced trips. Médecins Sans Frontières in particular is a huge champion of eflornithine as an essential treatment. The problem is that is not a market that makes any money. It doesn't even cover the cost of production, much less the prior fixed sunk costs of R&D. So the patent holder, Aventis, discontinued production of eflornithine. They said, listen, we just can't afford to be losing money with every dose we produce. So I'm sorry, there's going to be one less treatment for trypanosomiasis out there. This elicited all sorts of outroar from the global humanitarian and public health community, as you can imagine, but there's not much they can do. The patent holder is not willing to produce because they're losing money. After several years where this product wasn't available for treating sleeping sickness patients, however, they discovered that this same substance, eflornithine, when put into a cream, is very effective at removing unwanted facial hair. And so a product, Viniqua, shown in the image here, was born. And Viniqua has proved commercially very successful. Viniqua created a reason for its producer, Bristol Myers Squibb, to bring eflornithine back into production with the happy byproduct that now there was again a treatment available for an advanced neglected tropical disease. So the lesson here from the eflornithine case, which the Benevolent patent extensions idea develops more further, is that we need a lucrative prospective market like cancer treatments to elicit investment. And we need a luxury product for the well-off that can sustain the production like Viniqua. This is not something anybody's life depends on, unlike cancer treatments or a treatment for advanced trypanosomiasis, but it creates the market. It creates real commercial value. The key, however, also is that this was an unusual case of serendipitous dual use discovery. And it is so uncommon, we can't count on that happening routinely. So we need a way of leveraging the Viniqua type power to generate a medicine to treat the diseases of the poor without relying on the same substance, the same discovery, doing both, having both functions. So how do we do this? Well, a Benevolent patent extension would offer the inventor of a benevolent discovery, which is a discovery that has charitable rather than profit objectives. It's intended to help people with rare genetic diseases or with neglected tropical diseases or farmers who cultivate crops that earn relatively little. It's intended to help them, but would be unlikely to ever turn a profit in a commercial market. And in exchange for two conditions, a public use condition, that when you file for a Benevolent, you file for a patent, you ask the Patent and Trademark Office in the United States to award you a Benevolent patent extension. You then pledge that you won't enforce the Benevolent Discoveries patent or you'll dedicate it to the public. Either way, that makes the new discovery on a neglected tropical disease or an orphan crop freely publicly available without fee to anybody who wishes to use it, whether it's licensed or simply made in open access. The second condition is an assurance of availability condition that you'll ensure that there will be production and distribution for at least some minimum term of the Benevolent discovery. So one pledges an inventor when filing for a patent on a Benevolent discovery makes the pledges of public use and assurance of availability, and in exchange, they will be granted an extension on another non-essential patent. Now, note that the issue here is that most Benevolent discoveries are based on philanthropic and public research and development investments. There really aren't patent incentives for Benevolent discoveries. You just get these serendipitous discoveries like in eflornithine. So the key here after the public use.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up pretty quickly. We're squeezing in one more presentation before people are starving for lunch. And so if you could just wrap up.
I've got just a couple slides. I'm almost done. So the key here is these two conditions. You would only be allowed to extend a non-essential patent, something that doesn't save lives. So you can't extend patents on diabetes treatments or cancer treatments, but you can on male pattern baldness drugs or improved ball bearings for skateboards or business software. So all of those sorts of things are really crucial. The key here is you're going to target high value luxury lifestyle products, high income elasticity, low price elasticity demand goods. So there is a lot of consumer surplus that can get extracted by the patent holder who extends that patent. Patent and trademark offices already extend patents routinely. They do it for other reasons. This is a relatively easy change to the US code. This boosts the value of the Benevolent discovery. It's fully voluntary. Nobody is obliged to surrender patent like under compulsory licensing. No consumer has to continue to pay for a monopoly premium, but it accelerates availability of such discoveries. It induces investment and accelerates their availability, and it's expressly progressively redistributive. It's meant to transfer from the consumer surplus of well-off consumers like all of us to those who are going to benefit from having better crops and better medical treatments. It also has the possible benefit of inducing more investment in R&D capacity in the global South, because so much of the R&D needed for orphan crops or neglected tropical diseases has to happen in situ. So you'll need facilities and human capital in those places. The paper is available on my website. I would welcome comments, happy to talk offline with people afterwards. Thanks so much. And again, sorry I can't be there.
No problem. Thanks. Okay, for our last presentation today, I'm going to turn it over to a colleague over on this side, if you want to go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry for keeping you. I will be very fast, I promise. So I'm Lana Awada, University of Saskatchewan. I'm a senior policy fellow in food security. I carry a PhD in agriculture economics. Today, I'll be talking about measuring greenhouse gas emission. Move there, sorry. Today, I'll be talking about measuring greenhouse gas emission sources and sink in the Canadian Prairies crop sector. Away from all the negative news about greenhouse gas emission, this presentation or this measures will give you some hope that yes, greenhouse gas emission can be reduced in the crop sector. We started with the idea of if you cannot measure greenhouse gas emission, how are you gonna manage it? So that's what we are doing in this presentation. I'll start by my presentation by giving you a quick overview of Canada's emission and the related climate change policies. In 2018, Canada's greenhouse emission reached 730 million ton of CO2 equivalent, accounting for 2% of the global greenhouse gas emission. Ranking Canada the fourth largest per capita emitter among the OECD countries. Also, the emission per capita reduced from 23 to 19 between 2005-2016. That remains higher than the average OECD per capita emission, which is 12 tons of CO2 equivalent. At the provincial level, the emission decreased in most of the Canadian prairies, except for the prairies provinces, which increased in Alberta by 17%, Manitoba and Saskatchewan by 10% between 2005-2019. Alberta's emission accounts for 37% of Canada's emission and reflects the province reliance on energy extractive industry. In order to reduce greenhouse gas emission, Canada had signed all major climate change agreements. The Earth Summit 1992, Kyoto Protocol 2002, Copenhagen Accord 2009, and most recent Paris Agreement 2016. The core objective of the countries to the Paris Agreement is to undertake a nationally determined contribution, NDCs, toward the response to global climate change. Canada's NDCs is reflected by the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. The framework is built on initial commitment to the COP21. The initial commitment is to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 30% by below the level of 2005 by 2030. However, earlier this year in March, Canada announced the 2030 emission reduction plan, which aiming at reducing greenhouse gas emission between 40 and 45% below the level of 2005 by 2030, and to reach net zero emission by 2050. At the sectoral level, the agriculture sector accounts for about 10% of the total Canada's emission. Of that, 6.5% accounted by the crop sector. The agriculture sector emission was estimated that it was increased by 24% between 1990 and 2016. The problem with this estimate is that it did not include, or it wasn't adjusted for the greenhouse gas emission and removal by land use change and forestry, or what's called by the United Nations LULUCF. The PCF will promising in the future to include the LULUCF in the National Inventory of Greenhouse Gas Emission. Including land use in the calculation and the measurement of greenhouse gas emission is very important for the Canadian prairies, as they account for 82% of the total arable land in Canada, or 52 million hectares, divided 20 in Alberta, Saskatchewan 25, and Manitoba 7. In addition, in the last 40 years, the Canadian prairies had adopted sustainable technologies, particularly zero tillage, which reduced or replaced summer fallow by crop rotation, and at the same time improved farmers' productivity and profitability. An important feature of zero tillage is that it promotes carbon sequestration, or it increased the soil carbon stock, which in turn is gonna reduce greenhouse gas emission. And that's what we are trying to do in this study. So to fill this gap, we try to quantify the contribution of agricultural land use in the to the greenhouse gas emission and removal in the Canadian prairie crop sector for the period between 1985 and 2016. That will include emission and sinks associated with different crop production practices, including, for example, conventional tillage, minimum tillage, zero tillage, summer fallow, crop rotation, residue retention, and the rate of input use, such as fertilizer and fuel. To reduce uncertainty and to provide more information, the analysis is conducted at the soil climate zones, which are divided in the Canadian prairies into 5. The darker the soil color, the higher the soil organic matter, and the whole the precipitation. We provide also the analysis at the provincial level and the total Canadian prairies region. We mainly measure soil carbon stock as a net source or a net sink of CO2. The emission is from fertilizer application, nitrous oxide from fertilizer application, N2O from crop residue, and from summer fallow. And we measure the fuel used for the production of crops and for the transportation of outputs and inputs. All measures, the net balance, the net greenhouse gas emission is calculated by subtracting the soil carbon stock at the source or sink from the total emission, including fertilizer, crop residue, summer fallow, and fuel. Everything is converted into CO2 equivalent using the base of global warming potential over 100-year time horizon. To monitor the change, we compare the estimates of 2016 with those of 1985, the base year of this data set, and of 2005, the reference year for Canada's NDCs for Paris Agreement. We use the prairie crop energy model, which divides the Canadian prairies into 22 crop districts, already defined by Statistic Canada. For each soil zone, we divide the arable land into 122 crop activities defined by the type of crop, land management, crop rotation, and soil characteristics. Data are obtained mostly from Statistic Canada, and the environmental coefficients and methods are obtained from Environmental Canada or previous prairies studies, or from international sources such as the International Panel on Climate Change. The measurement of soil carbon stock, as I mentioned before, soil can be either a source or sink for carbon, depending on current and historical crop production practices. The soil carbon stock reflects the balance between carbon lost into the atmosphere as a result of the decomposition of soil organic matter, and this is the CO2 source of emission, and carbon put into the soil through the incorporation of crop residue, and that's the carbon sink or carbon sequestration. The adoption of zero tillage enabled higher carbon return to the soil through the adoption of crop rotation, residue retention, and the lower soil organic matter decomposition rate associated with summer fallow and tillage practices. Also, zero tillage improves soil water capacity, which improves soil organic matter and soil biomass, resulting in a higher soil carbon sequestration. I will skip this, and you don't want probably to go through the technical, but this is the method used for soil carbon stock, crop production emission for fertilizer, crop residue retention, summer fallow emission, and fuel for crop production and transportation of inputs and outputs. I will move to the results. This is the aggregate results for the Canadian Prairies. The orange columns reflect the total emission, which increased from 11 million ton of CO2 equivalent in 1985 to 13 in 2005 to reach 18 million ton of CO2 equivalent. Carbon sequestration increased from 0.4 to -8 in 2005 to reach -16 in 2016. The net greenhouse gas emission, which is the orange, we subtract the orange from the blue. As you can see, it started to decrease in the 1990s to move from 10 to 5 in 2005 and to reach 2 million ton of CO2 in 2016. The net greenhouse emission in 2016 decreased by 80% compared to 1985 and by 57% compared to 2005. Moving to the disaggregated level, Alberta followed the same trend. The net greenhouse emission, the black line, decreased from 3 in 1985 to 2.4 2005 and to reach net sink in 2016. Alberta net greenhouse emission in the period between 2009 and 2015 on average was net zero. Saskatchewan, the same. The decrease started in the 1990s in parallel with the adoption of zero tillage and decreased to almost zero in 2005 to reach 0.12 in 2016. Again, the net, on average, net greenhouse gas emission in between the period 2007 and 2016 in Saskatchewan was about almost zero. Manitoba has different trend. Manitoba's net greenhouse emission did not change for the full period. Started in 1985, it was 2.14, and in 2016, it stayed the same, 2.1. The reason behind that is that the soil carbon stock in this province did not increase enough to mitigate the increase in the greenhouse gas emission. And this is mainly because the adoption of zero tillage in this province is very low. In 1985, it was only 5%. It increased to 20% in 2016. For example, in Saskatchewan is like about 75% adoption. And the reason behind this low adoption of zero tillage in Manitoba is that the province experienced since the 1999 experienced high rate of precipitation and lots of flood events between 2011 and 2014, which requires tilling the soil to warm up the land for seeding. And the adoption of some crops that require tilling, such as potato, and also of crops such as soybeans and corn that are heat lover and require tilling the soil to warm up the land. The emission on the prairie, we identified two major sources of emission: fertilizer application and fuel for transportation. Fertilizer application increased by 91% in Alberta, 98% in Saskatchewan, and 77% in Manitoba. The increased use of fertilizer is mainly because the switch from summer fallow to crop rotation, which is expected, to increase the use of fertilizer. But the other problem that requires some research is the low nutrient uptake efficiency of fertilizers that farmers are using these days. The efficiency of fertilizer available in the market ranges between 25 to 50% only. And the potential solution to improve the fertilizer efficiency is by using the 4R nutrient management: right source, right rate, right timing, and right placement, smart farming or digital farming, and nanotechnologies. These technologies are promising to improve the efficiency of all inputs in production. The fuel used for transportation of output and inputs is a result of the decrease in the number of grain delivery points and grain elevator, which increase the distance between farms and these points. For example, in Alberta, the grain delivery points decreased by 82%, Saskatchewan 78%, and Manitoba 66%. Grain elevators number decreased by 87% in Alberta, 84% in Saskatchewan, and 73% in Manitoba. I will conclude. The result of this presentation provides strong evidence that sustainable agriculture can reduce greenhouse gas emission. The reduction in greenhouse gas emission in the crop sector on the prairies was 80% compared to between 1985 and 2016, and 57% between 2005 to 2016. These percentages exceeded Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement. We identified 3 priority areas for mitigation that require research-based policy responses: the intensive tillage practices in Manitoba, the increased use of fertilizer, and the fuel that is used for the transportation of inputs and outputs. Thank you very much. And sorry for keeping you.